Hey everyone, welcome back to another Ask GN. As always, you can leave your questions for next time in the comment section below, or if you're a Patreon backer, you can post them in the Ask GN Patreon chat channel, or if you also want the extra version of Ask GN after this with just a couple of the extra Patreon questions, you can support us on Patreon, where we'll distribute the second additional episode for Ask GN for this week. So this one, we've got a couple good questions. There were quite a few people asking about X370 versus X470 testing for Ryzen Plus or Ryzen 2, depending on what you want to call it. So we'll be talking about that. We've got a couple of other good ones, like how do you balance criticism and not leave manufacturers mad, for example, is definitely worth talking about. So we'll go through those for this week's episode. Before that, this video is brought to you by Thermal Grizzly, makers of the Conductonaut liquid metal that we recently used to drop 20 degrees off of our coffee lake temperatures. Thermal Grizzly also makes traditional thermal compounds for use on top of the IHS, like Cryonaut and Hydronaut pastes. Learn more at the link below. First question is about X370 versus X470. So this was asked in a couple places. Patreon most recently, the Discord is where I saw it posted. And just to kind of address this early, first of all, yes, we do have and have had a Ryzen 2 or 2000 series or Ryzen Plus chip, whatever you want to call it. We are technically not under the embargo for that CPU because we sampled it through other channels, not through AMD. However, we are planning to launch our review at the same time as embargo lift with all the other reviews. So I'm not going to go too detailed, even though technically I could. But what I will do is address the basic question of, are you testing X370 versus X470? The answer is yes, we already have. And we'll present that data when the embargo lifts, even though technically we don't have to. But out of respect for other media, we'll do it for this one. So X370 versus 470 then. I suppose the main question is whether the platform change improves performance, one, for the previous Ryzen CPUs and two, for the new ones coming up, because you can run them interchangeably on either platform. And the answer is it kind of depends. So without going into all the test data and stuff right now, the part where it depends is that if the motherboards are perfectly identical, which we don't have two that are perfectly identical outside of the chipset, it'd be easier to test. But because motherboards tune the lower unseen memory timings differently, because there are other changes in how the socket behaves in terms of how much power it's pushing to the CPU, current limits, power limits, things like that are all under the surface, it's a little harder to neutralize all the variables and test and see, is there just an outright difference, A versus B? There is a difference. Sometimes it's not what you would expect, but we're still looking into it. And a lot of this comes down to things like, does the vendor for the motherboard you're using, for the EFI version they have, does the vendor force XFR2 on by default, the upgraded version of extended frequency range, or XFR for Ryzen? Do they force that on by default? Do they force, what power settings do they enforce for the CPU? What kind of power limits do they have in place? So these things impact the performance more than just a straight chipset change. But we're doing our best to isolate all the variables and look at it for you. That said, you can't isolate all of them, and ultimately at some point you are looking at differences that are almost more between the UEFI tuning than they are between just the chipset alone. Other than that, there aren't too many chipset changes, honestly. We'll talk about that more later, but there are definitely BIOS level changes from the vendors. They've all kind of done some extra tuning. They've had more time to allow Ryzen to mature. X370 matured, so X470 is looking a bit better. Things are stable on both platforms for us right now. We haven't had any blue screens or severe crashes or defects or anything bad like that, so that's encouraging to see. But we'll clue you in on all the performance when we decide to post it, which, as I said, will be basically in line with all the other reviews. We're mostly going to follow that embargo, even though we don't have to. But yeah, subscribe to make sure you catch that. Answer the question though, yes, we are testing them. We have tested them. We'll have data for you when the review goes live. So next one is from TJCCBR47, who said, Ask GN how to balance criticism and not leave manufacturers mad. You lost CoolerMaster samples, HardOCP lost Nvidia samples, Guru 3D lost Intel samples. Do you think it's fair not receiving samples, or is it some kind of censorship? This is a really good question. It's kind of complicated, but I'll condense it as best I can. The last one's the easiest. Do you think it's fair not receiving samples, or is it some kind of censorship? It's fair to not receive samples. We're not entitled to samples. We're not entitled to free product review. We're not entitled to loaner products review. If they don't want to send it, that's completely within their rights. It's not censorship. At the end of the day, it's our job in media to, if we feel like they're trying to censor us, or to use your word, censor us, or if they're trying to prevent us from reviewing a product that for some reason would be received poorly by us, it's our job at some level to go buy it, which we've done in the past. I think we made a pretty big statement to everyone when we bought a Titan V. I think that pretty much shows the extent we're willing to go to. Now, it's not always possible to buy samples. And this also gets into a greater discussion of launch timing. Because if companies cut you out of the review cycle because you've criticized them for some reason, the bigger impact isn't that you're not getting the product, because most of the outlets, if they had to, could buy these things. The bigger issue is that you might not be able to get it before launch. So we can try and work with third parties, with partners we have in the industry, people we've known a long time, to try and get something ahead of launch through an unofficial channel. It doesn't always work out. They often don't have the stuff that early either, or have limited quantities. So worst case scenario, like with the H500p mesh, we have to buy it when everyone else does, and basically same day or next day ship it, and then get the review up ASAP. So in doing that, yes, we're able to get the product, we're able to review it, we bypass any attempts at cutting us from the review process, but we do miss that critical launch day window. So H500p mesh, just kind of based on experience, I think we would have done about 30,000 more views if we posted it on launch day, as opposed to a couple days later, just to give you an idea. So that is something that you feel an impact from as a media outlet. Fortunately, as our channel and as other channels grow, and you develop a following that trusts you, some of that loss of initial views from a day one posting being missed is made up for just by having a really strong core audience that supports you. And in our case, we'll come and watch the H500p mesh review, for example, even days after it's launched, just because people want to see what we had to say about it. So there is some give and take. There's definitely, if a vendor wants to punish you for saying something critical, which they often do, it kind of depends on which manufacturer it is, they all behave a bit differently. If they want to punish you for it, typically what happens is this. They'll often cut us or other people out from the review cycle for 1 to 2 product launches. After that point, you're pretty much guaranteed that they'll either grow up and get over it, or the PR people may have changed, because PR people in the industry change all the time. It's kind of a revolving door. Someone at company A will be at company B next month. And as long as your relationship with the people is okay, then you can keep those the product sampling relationships established as they move companies, even if you're critical. Because if the people, and they often do, understand why we're being critical, they'll do their best to advocate for us getting samples. And I know some of the companies who've cut us out of the cycle in the past have done that, the PR people, but it's often headquarters that puts the foot down and says, no, they're meanies and we don't like it, so don't give them stuff, because that'll stop them. But anyway, so that's kind of the first half of the question. The rest of it, how do you balance it? I mean, to balance it, we don't really cover much Kingston stuff anymore, but I want to talk about Kingston. So Kingston was the first hardware company I really worked with closely in a sampling capacity in the industry. Kingston and Rosewell. And Kingston, when I spoke with their PR, our main PR contact at the time, what he said to me when I asked a similar question was, just be fair. Just do your best to report on the product in a fair capacity. If you encounter issues, hopefully before launch, contact the company, talk to them, establish, is this my fault? Is it their fault? Is it a third party's fault? Is it Microsoft Windows being funny? Whatever the issue is, try to talk to them about it, and just make sure they're aware that you have a problem. And as long as it's not something they can solve, then yeah, of course, criticize it or make an issue of it or whatever as necessary. But giving people a heads up like that and trying to work with them does a lot to making sure you keep getting sampled, even if there's something critically wrong. Because it shows that you're willing to provide the opportunity for them to correct one of your mistakes, mine in this case, or to correct a product mistake. If it's before launch and it's maybe a software issue, they could probably push an update out if it's not too severe and get it fixed. So if you give them that opportunity and don't blindside them on launch day, then often a lot of stuff can actually get resolved. And ultimately, the goal is, of course, there are two goals for us. One is that the product should be as good as it can be. So if I can talk with the manufacturer and improve it indirectly before launch, and the customer buys it and they get the improved version, my job's basically half done. The next part of the job, of course, is making sure the consumer is getting something they actually need and is quality. So I guess the main thing I learned from the conversations with that PR rep ages ago was, if you're not trying to put, I don't know, a dent in their armor, and you're actually trying to work with them on troubleshooting the issue and establishing that it is an issue, and you explain why your views are what they are, everything's pretty much okay. We had a phone call with CoolerMaster before our H500P original review went live. I went over every single problem I had with it, and their answers were unsatisfactory. So that's why you saw the review you saw. But I think that answers a lot of it. To recap here, is it fair to not get samples? Yes, they can do that if they want to. It might seem petty. It kind of depends on the situation. But ultimately, we know that the companies will cycle back through. They'll come back eventually. And you know, I'm fine with criticizing it and losing samples and buying it myself if I have to, because if I were doing this to get free stuff all the time, then I like, what's the point? I get a different job. Because you got to look at why you're doing it. If you're in this business to produce good content, good reviews that are critical and analytical, then do it. There's no point in trying to pander to the manufacturer to keep getting free $100 cases or even $1,000 video cards. Because if you wanted to be in this job for the money, you're in the wrong job. Might as well go work for a manufacturer and make 2 to 3 times as much money working half the hours. That's how I look at it. So from the perspective of integrity and having it, just be fair, be critical of the products if they deserve it, and if the consequence is that you don't get it in the future, that's fine. Tell everyone you don't get it in the future, and the manufacturer will receive the reputation for cutting people off from criticizing them, and that will eventually turn around and bite them. So I guess that's more or less how I look at it. You have to, as an individual media outlet that is obviously smaller than the manufacturers, you have to put your foot down and say, no, this is bad, and hit them on the nose and tell them not to do it again. And if they don't give you one, so be it. I can spend $150 and buy a case. It's not a big deal. And also there are countless other products anyway that we could review instead. So, you know, the answer is be fair. Just be fair in the criticism, and everything should be okay. And if it's not, then screw them and buy it yourself. Next one is from Reps Up 100, who says, why doesn't AMD sell GPUs directly on their site like Nvidia does? I think Reps Up 100 has been around in these askgn since one of the first ones, actually. So I think this is me kind of speculating based on what I know of the industry. My kind of thoughts on that would be, Nvidia has a lot more leverage than AMD over their partners. Look at the GPP reports. So from Nvidia's perspective, what are you going to do? If Nvidia says we're going to start selling Founders Edition cards, and the partners are like, actually, could you not do that? What leverage do you really have? Everyone who makes Nvidia cards is just going to pick up your allocation if you don't have it. It's not like it won't advance the partners to complain about it. Maybe if they all got together and complained or something, I don't know. But that's, I guess, how I would see it. Nvidia's got the leverage to bypass their partners and sell directly. They don't seem to undercut their partners too much. There's clearly still a lot of cards being made by Asus, EVGA, and everyone else. But AMD, although they have basically mandated that some of their past cards were a specific design, like the Fury X, which only ever had one officially permitted design at launch anyway. That card was still sold by the partners, even though AMD made it, but it was never sold by AMD directly. That I remember. Maybe they've done it for 1 or 2 cards in the past, but I really don't remember anything recently. So I think it comes down to leverage. That would be my best guess on it, and where you can apply your leverage and what leverage you can pull as the biggest of the 2 manufacturers by a large margin. Next one is from Terence Gelo, who says, is there a cost difference to manufacturers between FreeSync and GSync at a hardware or software integration level? I see FreeSync integrated into a lot more products, and products with GSync seem to be more expensive. I'm wondering why Nvidia is trying to widen their market share with consumers, but they're not as successful as AMD when it comes to providing incentives through third-party accessories like monitors. So this is a good question we've talked about before. GSync is more expensive than FreeSync. FreeSync is not free to implement or even to sell to the consumer, but it's cheaper. So GSync has 2 primary costs. One of them is the FPGA board that's on the monitor. So they actually have a physical piece of hardware that goes on the monitor. It's not necessarily cheap to make it. That's the GSync module. And that's what does the GSync processing on Nvidia's version of an advanced V-blank attribute under the is it a display port specification, HDMI? Either way, it's kind of like the V-blank attribute that's leveraged for FreeSync. Nvidia will tell you it has a lot more advanced functionality and that it's smoother and things like that, and that paying for the board gets you a higher quality. That's their angle. They basically they say we make a higher quality version of adaptive synchronization by providing a physical piece of hardware to do the processing. So that piece of hardware is what is contributing to the cost. And again, note, I said Nvidia says that. It's their marketing on why they think theirs is better. The other cost is validation. And this one applies to FreeSync as well. So FreeSync is relatively free. We had an interview ages ago with Robert Halleck at AMD. I think it was either on camera or he was just off camera answering my questions. And when I asked him how free is FreeSync to the vendor, to the monitor maker, he said, well, you still have validation cost, but other than that, it's basically free. So yeah, they do have to pay someone to test it, to validate it, make sure it performs to whatever spec they're saying it does. That has a cost, but it's not a physical piece of hardware. So that's the differences in terms of why FreeSync is on monitors is cheaper than GSync effectively 100% of the time. And it's just no FPGA board. Next question. Mandragoras says, what I'd love to hear from you is explain how is it possible that consoles with their weak processors and weak GPUs can achieve such amazing results. According to what I read on the internet, I would expect an FX 8120 to be better than the Xbox One S or PS4's processor, and the GPUs to have similar performance to a GTX 650 Ti or 660 Ti accordingly. Despite the console games being watered down and optimized, why is it impossible for equal or slightly better PC components to handle the games the same? Then goes on to talk about what consoles lack in advanced graphics. This is another good question that we've talked about in the past, but just really briefly, what it comes down to is the consoles. You have an Xbox One, you have a PS4. First of all, both of those consoles are on Jaguar architecture. It's kind of fortunate that they're both on the same architecture. It's an AMD architecture for the CPU component. So they're both on the same or very similar architecture and CPU fundamentals, and that makes it easy to optimize for both of them. Secondly, even with the One, the One S, all the other derivatives in between, ultimately when a developer builds a game for the Xbox One or the PS4, they are building their game for functionally one set of hardware. Now with the refreshes, there are some that are slightly more powerful, but it's the same architecture at the end of the day, and typically the difference is 4K or not, so we can call it the same set of hardware. When you're building something for one set of hardware, it's a lot easier. You know what every customer has, so when you tune the game, you build the game, it's going to work the same on every platform. With PCs, you have a million variables. There are games where we've seen, for example, not long ago, Destiny 2 is a great example of one that affected both AMD and Nvidia. Both companies released patches either around beta or launch that improves performance on a GPU level with I think highest settings at 1440p by upwards of 30% or more. And that happens because the developers didn't optimize the shaders in a way that worked the best on the hardware that was affected. In this case, all of it, because it was Destiny 2. But with a console, you don't really expect stuff like that to get through because you don't really generally give settings customization, at least not to a level that would impact your validation process for performance. And you also only have one piece of hardware to tune for. So optimizing for shaders, the engineers, the software developers really don't have to know a whole lot about the options out there because it's basically one. And then I would assume on the engineering side, getting support from Microsoft or Sony or whomever is also going to be a bit more streamlined because you again have one piece of hardware to build for. I would also assume there's probably better documentation for different rendering or shader optimization techniques that can be used for consoles that maybe don't work on every piece of PC hardware. And that's why with some games you'll see the game perform really well on a particular set of AMD cards or a particular set of Nvidia cards, but maybe not their older architectures. It's because they weren't tuned for it. Because at some point as a developer, it all comes down to time and money. You run out of time, you run out of money, and what are you ultimately going to build for? You're going to build for the cards that are the most popular, or CPUs that are the most popular, and then everything else, if the game goes well, hopefully they release patches for them. But if otherwise, you build for 10 series Nvidia, maybe Vega and 500 series AMD, and call it a day there, which is why you see the optimization differences. Now, also, I should say, this discussion goes further with things like APIs. So a lot of games are still DirectX 11 on PC. Those games don't have very low-level access to the hardware. DirectX 11 is it has a lot of obfuscation layers between the game code and the hardware. There are extra layers in between. So if you think of it as a canonical view of a pipeline where you've got sort of like stop A, B, C, D, A and D are going to be your code and your hardware, and there's a bunch of abstraction layers in between, they're called. Whereas with the console, it's basically direct to metal. So DirectX 12 or Vulkan equivalents would be what you're using on console in terms of programming straight to the hardware without all of the abstraction layers. And that's a big deal. With DirectX 12 and Vulkan on PC, remove a lot of that. You'll see Sniper and Doom perform exceptionally well on PC hardware. That's because they're low-level APIs that have been used properly, and a lot of DirectX 12 implementations on PC are just wrappers, so they're just wrapping DX11 with it, and you end up with a slight performance loss or equal performance, and that's why DX12 doesn't always look good on PC. But basically, answering your question, it's API and how the code is written and the abstraction layers it has to go through to get to where it's going, which is the hardware, and then tuning for one set of hardware. I think that's most of it. I'm sure a couple of you probably have some other stuff I've overlooked or left out, but feel free to leave it below for everyone else. So next one, Jonas. I'm not going to try your last name. Petkevičius says, what do you think about Geforce Now, cloud-based gaming? PS, if you want to do a test, I can give you my account. I think we have one. Geforce Now, it's a really good idea. The idea that, so when I originally talked with Nvidia about Grid and other companies years ago about something similar, the starting point for that is when cable companies had more control over TV. The starting point was, well, imagine going to the most hated company on the planet, Time Warner Cable or AT&T or Comcast or any of the other ones, and also being able to get gaming on demand from them, not just movies on demand. So that was kind of the starting point. And it was an interesting idea where if you've got a TV and you have a controller, you lease access to the games for however much money they're willing to gouge you for, which is probably a lot because they're the worst companies on the planet. But that was the idea, and it's a pretty cool idea. And that processing would be done through external servers hosted in their data centers, hopefully somewhat locally. And then you're just dealing with latency at that point, which can be adjusted for. So I really like the idea of it. I don't think we're there today. And part of that is because last I checked, the upload and download speed requirements were still kind of high relative to what a lot of even America gets. Well, I say even America. Our internet's pretty bad here. We set the standard, but other countries as well, of course. So originally, I think it was a 5 megabit per second up requirement, which was way too high. And then we also had latency issues when I tried it last time, where they put us in front of Titanfall 2, and I just couldn't for the life of me aim at anything because the response to the input was just too delayed. But for a game that's not Titanfall 2, like maybe The Witcher or something like that, you'd be okay. So I think it has a ways to go. I'm very interested in the technology. I think Nvidia's implementation is a good one, where they have external servers that process everything. I would like to see latency improved, which they're working on, and then a business model that makes sense. Because originally the prices were too high, but they dropped them. So not yet, though. Not there yet. Okay, last couple ones. We've got Inversion, who says, pardon for the not so serious question, but any April Fool's plans in mind? Nope. Next question. Second Last Jedi. Why don't we see VR benchmarks? How does CPU affect VR performance? Is a 6600K enough for VR? 7700K going to be much better? 6600K is... Well, 6600K. You'll be okay for the most part. We have VR benchmarks. We actually, I think it's the channel, like, main video right now. Just go to the channel and search for probably VR benchmarks, or 7700K. If you Google search it, 7700K versus R1700 Gamers Nexus VR benchmark, you'll find it. So along with a couple of other outlets, PC Per included, we were some of the only people to have really in-depth VR testing, where we had frame times, we had frame drops versus synthesized frames versus warp misses, and all of these cool variables and elements and metrics for VR. The reason you don't see a lot of it, even from people who have it figured out, like us, PC Per, anyone else who did figure it out, is because it's hard to do. And also, the view count is not great either. So you're dealing with hours of setup just to get the testing ready to go. And then testing takes a long time because you need to test for longer intervals. It's also difficult because I have to physically put the headset on, walk around and do the testing, which means I need to clear the room out. I need to adjust for employee schedules even, because it basically requires that I have the lab to myself to do a VR test. And then further, you have to take breaks every now and then, because otherwise it is possible to get a pounding headache from testing VR for, say, 8 hours and dealing with low-end hardware that might have stuttering and things like that. It's really not comfortable. So it's difficult to do. It takes a lot of time to set up, and you'll probably lose money. But it's okay to do maybe quarterly or something like that, which is kind of how we've approached it. Next one, or last two. X470. Steve, love the shelf in the background. Looks great. Thank you. Will you be testing and reviewing Der Bauer's Skylake-X Direct Die Frame? Yes, we have one. It is a pre-production sample. I need to get a final review production sample from Der Bauer. I think he's sending one, and then hopefully we can do that. We had to work on the clearance. I basically need to sand off some of the pre-production model because it's very slightly different from the production model that you all would be buying. Last one. Emlay. What's wrong with the wood backdrop? Shelves? Trying to keep up with Jay's display? Yes, well, as you all know, we once filmed something in front of a pegboard with tools on it. And someone called us out and said Linus invented pegboards and that we were copying him. So it looks like, unfortunately, we're going to have to stop filming in front of the shelves because Jay also invented shelves. And we did not license shelves from Jay. So Jay, I'm really sorry. I didn't mean for it to go this way. But hopefully you can understand. We couldn't afford your licensing fees. So they'll be gone, I guess, next video. Pack it up. Thanks for watching, guys. Subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to pick up one of the new mod mats. They have a black background now and some other changes. We did a video on it. And also, patreon.com/gamersnexus helps out directly and get access to the second video with some extra Patreon backer questions. I'll see you all next time.